Right. Welcome to another edition of what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Today's episode is part 2 of the Runaways, leaning heavily on Joan Jett, especially towards the end. And we are going to wrap up talking about the Runaways movie, basically, and move into the film Light of Day by Paul Schrader, 1987, with Michael J. Fox and Michael McKean at the peak of their popularity, I would say, in a film with no humor and no comedy, no comedic lines, no comedic performances for either of those incredibly talented comedic musical gentlemen. What a film. I just finished watching it about 45 minutes ago. I've been chipping away at it for weeks and weeks. So I want to start off this episode with some great quotes from the band that were collected by Mark Spitz and Brendan Mullen, and some notes, again, about Kim Fowley. He was, in charge of his own narrative for a long, long time, I think, before the girls started speaking out against him years after their experience with him. He's the kind of guy that evidently, when Charles Manson was on trial in 1970, drove out to Spahn Ranch, if you know where that is, or know the significance of Spahn Ranch. It's depicted in the Tarantino film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, of course. And, the girls from the family were still living there at the time. So he and Rodney, evidently Rodney Bingenheimer and him, just pulled up to them. Kim leans out of the window and shouts, "I'm your new leader," according to Harvey Kubernick. He was just too weird. Also, if you were at a party and talking to a girl, he'd literally push you out of the way and say, "I'm Kim Fowley. I have 100 gold and platinum records. This guy doesn't." And since I didn't have a whole lot of the story from Sandy West's perspective on the last episode, I want to read a pretty substantial bit of this account of hers. She says, "One night in the summer of 75, I saw this guy in this weird orange suit at the Rainbow parking lot at closing time." The Runaways have talked about their time hanging around the Rainbow. They were trying to, meet rock stars and stuff and make friends and make contacts and get a band going, or, maybe find support for their band. "My girlfriend said, 'That's Kim Fowley. He's made records with Alice Cooper.' So I walked up to him and I said, 'My name's Sandy West and I'm a drummer.' And his eyes lit up and he said, 'Oh, really? Well, I know this girl who knows some girl in the Valley who plays electric guitar.' And I said, 'Really? I've been playing with guys all my life. A chick that can play guitar? I wonder how good she is.' Kim called me the next day to give me Joan's number. She took about 3 buses down here. Took her like 4 hours to get from Canoga Park to Huntington Beach. I figured that was pretty important to relate as well. These are the kind of things that you do when you're, desperate to get a cool band going and you can't drive yet and you live in a godforsaken place like LA when it comes to public transportation. It's been a mess forever. Ever since they burned all the trolleys and the streetcars down intentionally so they could build freeways, and then if you didn't have a car, you were screwed. And now if you have a car, you're screwed because you're just stuck on the freeway all the time. Anyway, rant over. Back to Sandy. She had a little Sears guitar, and I had my drums, a Marshall amp, and a piano set up above this 3-car garage at my parents' house. Joan walked in and I said, "Here's a fucking Marshall stack. What do you know how to play?" And she said, "The only thing I know is Susie Quattro. That's how I learned to play guitar." So I said, "Well, that's cool." We jammed on some song by Susie and she had perfect rhythm. I was like, "God, this is so right on the money." I told Kim, "This girl's got perfect timing." And his eyes just exploded out of his head. "A 15-year-old girl with perfect timing?" He said, "If there's 2 of you who can play well together, there's got to be more." Joan would come down to my parents' house on the weekends and we'd work on song ideas. Eventually, we'd go to Kim's apartment in Hollywood every weekend, writing and auditioning and talking to people. Kim relied on me as a musician to check the girls out. Now, next quote is from Ron Ashton. Ron Ashton was a goddamn guitar player for the Stooges, for fuck's sake. He says, Kim Fowley said to me, I need a place to audition women. So I hooked him up with this guy who'd been in the conductor of the NBC Orchestra for 25 years, who had this little practice studio out in the valley. I'd come by every once in a while and peep in on some of Kim's latest finds. It was really hilarious. It was hard to keep a straight face with some of the people who showed up for auditions. Now, in the previous episode, I talked a little bit about how this is an out-of-the-ordinary scenario for me to talk about a band or evaluate their work because, the Runaways, by and large, didn't write their own songs entirely. They co-wrote them with Kim and with Kim's writing partner, who's Carrie Crome. A lot of the lyrics were written for them to say that they wouldn't have come up with themselves, but, Joan Jett became a fairly prolific writing partner with Kim and Carrie. Especially writing the lyrics to Cherry Bomb on the spot when Cherie Currie showed up to try out and didn't know a lot of songs that they could play. I also feel that a lot of the tunes they're so rooted in the mid-70s rock and roll approach. They sound anthemic, but the lyrics are largely, I would say, non-transmissible to other situations or other time frames. Context is a motherfucker. The song lyrics can be specific, but also a little too vague sometimes. So, I don't know. It's another one of those bands like the New York Dolls that I think if you related to them specifically, and especially if you were there at the time to see it happen and see the change that came because of their work, it probably has more of an impact than the average rock and roll listener who isn't going to pick this stuff up. And I'm saying this about a lot of bands from the mid 70s. I'm talking, T-Rex influenced kind of bands that weren't as musically adept as a Led Zeppelin, but they also weren't as clever and witty with their lyrics, as someone like Elvis Costello, although I know he's not 1975, he's a few years later, but you know what I mean? It also wasn't, these lyrics aren't defining of a generation like stuff from the Clash and the Sex Pistols that harnessed the sort of youthful energy of their own audience in the places where they lived. And they're not as fun and ridiculous and relatable in a fun, offensive, weird, aggressive way like Ramones lyrics either. All this is to say, if you love the Runaways and you love the lyrics, you found your band. This is your band for sure. And it makes perfect sense to me that you could feel that way about them and that people would take this band to their hearts and really, really get behind them even decades later and feel that there's someone speaking in a way that they respond to about rock and roll, about, being a chick in a dude's world, having something to prove, but also not giving a fuck about what people say about you. That's going to be, obviously an ongoing theme in Joan Jett's work for years after this. So what Jackie Fox had to say about the songs was that they were extremely simplistic and most of the lyrics were really very silly, although there were a few that I really liked. Kim claimed to have fed in every set of Beatles lyrics into a computer and had it spit out the words that were most commonly used, and then he wrote a song using those words. It was the worst song we ever did. There's an important note from Sandy, who says, I wasn't aware of our image at first or how Kim was promoting us. That's an ongoing theme, isn't it, with the story of the Runaways? Not just the promotion, but every single thing he did that they weren't aware of until it was too late. I just love playing my instrument. I didn't give a shit. I'm not a feminist, but I still didn't like the group being called Sex Kittens or Teenage Jailbait by Kim. Now, I want to remind you, Sandy West has been dead for a few years. And if you're younger, let's say in your teens, 20s, or around there, try not to judge her use of the word feminist by your modern interpretation of the word feminist. I know you don't think it's an interpretation, but it is. It's undergone some changes in our culture, at least modern day America. That's where I'm speaking from. And obviously I'm not speaking as a woman. I'm speaking as a guy who was a kid in the 80s and a teenager in the 90s. And the word feminist meant something different. You didn't hear a lot of the word feminist back in those days. So what she grew up with as feminist was probably a little more demonstrative, a little more marching, a little more, carrying signs for women's lib and things like that. I think she's basically saying, I'm not an activist about it, but I think a lot of people today would say, just by the statements she made, she is a feminist. Just by saying, I don't appreciate us being marketed as sex kittens or teenage jailbait by a man. I think it's fair to say a lot of modern day feminists would say, nope, maybe unwittingly or unknowingly, but that's a feminist statement. Now, to talk about the recording of the first album, Cherie says it was like a matter of days. And right after the recording, she was doing interviews right after it. It was a total blur. They're still going to school, and they had to get permission to get sort of like released on a furlough so they could go, tour and play shows because they're underage. And I'm sure they had to have their parents sign off on that. And during their time managed by Kim Fowley would call their parents and assure them that the girls were doing fine and everything was A-okay and everyone was safe and healthy and blah, 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 blah. When, the parents didn't really know any better. They didn't know they were being lied to by the guy who was allegedly ripping off their daughters financially. But that's a lot of what the music business is. It's people that make deals and then take more money than they tell you that they're taking and hand you. This goes for everyone that's ever been a performer. This is just what happens. It's not good. We don't have to like it, but it happens to all of us. Joan's got a pretty interesting account. Again, this is from We've Got the Neutron Bomb by Mark Spitz and Brendan Mullen. Of the time they went to see Patti Smith at Huntington Beach because they'd heard a lot about her. Obviously, Patti Smith, she's from the CBGB era punk art movement. So she's coming, to Huntington Beach all the way from the East Coast. And her husband's name is Lenny Kaye. He was her guitar player. And he's quite the rock and roll historian himself. I hope to start amassing some sort of a collection of his writings. Most of what I've seen has been online so far, but he's probably got some books out I should be reading right now. But Joan says that Lenny Kaye had seen us at the Starwood, which is a well-known club in LA. That would be one of the places that Van Halen would break and get pretty big eventually. And he really liked us. So we were backstage talking to him, and then we went back to meet Patti. And the second we got in the dressing room, I was second to last, so I didn't even make it in. She goes, "Get those bitches out of here." Ivan, her guitarist, was wearing a Runaways t-shirt on stage. She was being real rude to us for no reason. We were trying hard to be nice, and she just walked on by. Lenny said that Patti was only into her own trip, and we just weren't in her world. We were getting in her way. I guess she was seeing us as female competition. She couldn't even say, "Would you please leave?" She just threw us out. We were real hurt. And then when it comes to the first tour, Jackie talks about them just trying to survive on the road. Kim had passed tour management over to Scott Anderson, and Scott was dating Cherie. He had all the money, and he and Cherie would just disappear, and the rest of us would be left in the middle of nowhere with no money, trying to figure out how to eat. We were completely unsupervised. We were living like runaways. It's noted in, I think it was the Edge Play documentary, that, Cherie herself says, he thought she kind of fell for him as this dopey, older puppy dog kind of a guy that she thought was kind of cute in a weird way. And one day, Jackie Fox is like the last band member to show up to a band meeting, with Kim Fowley. And as soon as she walks in the door, everyone stops talking and Kim points at her and goes, "Did you fuck Scott?" And she goes, "No." And he goes, "Well, you're the only fucking one who didn't." And talking about some of the relationships in the band. We talked in the last episode about sort of the dividing lines and who would pair up with who and kind of have loyalty and then kind of go against the others. Also, how Kim Fowley made that worse at every chance he got, turned them against each other. Cherie says, "Joan and I were inseparable. They used to call us salt and pepper. Lita was very hard, very intimidating. She seemed angry all the time, and she scared me. I wanted to be her friend terribly, but she was just so tough. I was uncomfortable around her. Jackie was just a whiner. She just whined about everything, and she would get on everybody's nerves. That seems to be, unfortunately for Jackie, the common theme in all these interviews. You know, she was the prissier one. She was the one. I think Lita Ford said, you know, she was always saying she was allergic to stuff, and the list of things she was allergic to was like growing by the week. She also knew we were getting ripped off, and she was trying to open our eyes to all this, but we were too afraid to rock the boat. So there you go. That's how you practice the divide and conquer politics in a band. The one person that's getting hip to the fact that you're ripping off these girls is the one that none of the girls really like or bond with. Perfect for you if you're the master manipulator behind all of this. Jackie also has some good notes about their tour in the UK. She said that in England, the Runaways got lumped in with the punk scene. The crowds over there were almost all male, who were there ready to ogle. We were playing Liverpool, and the crowd broke through the safety barrier, and I remember being rushed off stage. I remember looking out in the crowd at Leeds University, not seeing one female face, just these really pimply, wound-up young males pressing up against the stage. And I remember praying there was enough security. Japanese crowds were a lot nicer, and the support was more genuine and a little less lecherous. Japan was a lot of fun. England was scary. The record company threw a party for us, and the Sex Pistols crashed it and set it on fire. I'm going to get into detail about Japan in a little bit, but I'm going to keep going here with these quotes from the Neutron Bomb book, because Sandy talks about how amazing it was to be playing in the punk scene over there. During that first tour in England, they were spitting at us on stage, so we started spitting back. And I'm going to share this next bit from Lita because it just sounds like pure Lita. The more spit you got, the better you were. Oh, fuck yeah. We had loogies hanging over us by the end of each set. It was great. Now I'd run for the antibacterial wipes, but back then it was just awesome. Man, look at that loogie on your neck. That's cool. We just got spat on left and right. In Europe, the whole audience was just a sea of leather and denim, bad to the bone. Everybody was drunk off their ass, especially me. So while they're over there, they're supposed to be playing like 6 weeks, and then that gets extended into a full 3-month tour. When they get back from that tour and they start working on their second record, Darby Crash and Pat Smear showed up at the studio one day to tell the Runaways that they were going to start a band because I guess they were friendly with them. This is before they formed the Germs. Pat Smear, some of you may recognize that name as the gentleman that came on as Nirvana's only successful second guitarist of all time. Obviously, he came on at the Unplugged era and the, actually before that, the In Utero era live. And he was probably the only one they really respected, or Kurt Cobain seemed to have respected, obviously because of his pedigree from the LA punk scene. Joan says that they'd see us play gigs in Hollywood and they got inspired. Darby liked the tough girl thing, the rebel aspect. He got a real kick out of that. We were really flattered. Kim says, I'd seen them around before. They were male groupies lurking for the Runaways. More like baby brothers, but there was some male groupie veneer beneath their shtick. Sandy says, the Germs were really sweet people who told everybody that we influenced them. That's cool. I like them. They were fun to be around. Me and Joan were the kind of people whose vibe was always, come over to my apartment and hang out. Her parties were pretty notorious. Again, I'm going to jump around in the timeline here because I want to talk about Japan, but I don't want to leave that little bit behind about the Germs, okay? The involvement with the Germs is really important, especially in Joan Jett's later career. So if we're going to talk about the Germs, let's hear the words of Matt Groening, creator of The Simpsons and Life in Hell and Futurama, because he says that the punks that came into Licorice Pizza, the record store where I worked, which is now the name of a film that's coming out, I guess. The record store where I worked were a combination. There were very idealistic kids who were totally into the scene. And then there were these kids who would create a ruckus in order to distract us so they could shoplift. Most of these kids were associated with the Germs. Rodney Bingenheimer said, one day Darby Crash from the Germs, came on my show and he was giving out satellite numbers over the air so people could make free long-distance calls. KK Barrett says, I had a lot of one-on-one conversations with Darby about religion as a business. The whole idea that you could start your own religion and make money off of it, which was an obvious L. Ron Hubbard reference Darby had picked up on. He brought me books on Scientology, and he also talked about how religion was basically just a funnel for lost souls. But his songs kept getting better and better. The Screamers even did a cover of the Germs' Sex Boy at our shows, which was the equivalent of like the Stones doing I Want to Be Your Man, written by the Beatles. John Doe says the Germs became really scary after Bobby changed his name to Darby. They began to fuck stuff up. Their audience fucked stuff up. Their music, and in particular Darby's stage persona, was very different than his private personality. The stage was where he could do whatever he wanted. On stage, he was much more violent. The music made people feel that way. It was incredibly dark. The Germs were much darker than most of the other bands. Darby's writing is nothing like the kind of person he was. He was much more kind of a valley kid, a goofy California kid. But obviously there was something behind him that was very secret and weird. You didn't know the words because it was all like, "War" when Darby sang them live. So everyone was just astounded later when they got that first Slash record and actually read the lyrics. They were great. I know he cheated a lot. He used a thesaurus. How did I pronounce that like Mike Tyson? Thesaurus. He'd take Nietzsche's books, pick stuff out that sounded cool, and reflected his feelings. And he was able to put those words together really well. He'd never use words like he'd write in regular conversation. So Darby's got a reputation for being a loose cannon. Germs have a reputation for sometimes being a mess, you know, taking 10 to 20 minutes to just tune their instruments on stage to make noise to piss people off, and then, you know, smearing peanut butter, mayonnaise all over the place or on themselves. Darby had a reputation for showing up at LA punk shows that were held in someone's living room and like smearing spaghetti all over the walls, things like that. Someone has a story about watching him put like gutter water into a syringe and shooting it into his own body in some place. I assume that didn't kill him instantly. So I say all that to set up what's going to come around with Joan Jett in a little bit. But to set that up, let's get some background on the Runaways in Japan. They go over there. They have an incredibly successful, you know, series of shows and interviews and press conferences. They find that the young women in Japan especially worship them and want to get close to them and probably tear them all to pieces if they can get their hands on them like they're the Beatles. Because of all the sexual repression and the repression of, you know, women in society. They have to be reserved, they have to be docile, and they have to be subjugated to men. And the Donnas, Freudian slip. The Runaways, can you tell I'm a Donnas fan? The Runaways represent liberation from all that and a rebellion against all that and empowerment. So Japanese audiences just weren't really ready to deal with it in a rational way when they were faced with it. Unfortunately, during this time, it comes out that Cherie has done a like lingerie modeling spread alone without the rest of the Runaways. At Kim Fowley's behest, it was something that, according to the movie, she was sort of put up to by Kim, who said as soon as the band meeting is done or the rehearsal's done, stick around, or the band photos are done, stay here because you're going to take some more photos without them. And she didn't really plan on it, but she was too intimidated to say no. The rest of the band doesn't know about this. They keep it a secret. And then one day, as like one of the first days they were in Japan in their hotel rooms, their concierge or promoter of the show had laid out all this press, all these print magazines on their beds to show them how beloved they were in Japan already and how much coverage they had already. And that's the first time the rest of the band sees this, like, you know, lingerie photo spread of Cherie Currie all by herself. and there's a big fight about it, and that starts creating a rift between her and Joan. During this time, there's some accident with Jackie Fox's bass. It's her prized possession. It's a Gibson Thunderbird from the 60s, rare white finish. And as they're about to go on stage, the roadie tells her that her bass has been broken, and she kind of breaks herself. Internally, she feels she can't maintain her sanity anymore after all this, what she perceives as madness in her life. And she takes pieces of glass and starts hacking up her arms because she wanted to get out of the whole situation and get out of the band, and felt trapped. The night that it happened, she had called her friend Randy Rhoads of Quiet Riot and, talks to him. He was sort of a soothing voice of counsel for her to help calm her down and give her advice. And, then their road manager, Kent, lets her know that she's on reduced benefits in order to pay for that international phone call that she just charged to her room. She has to eat cheese sandwiches for the rest of the time that she's in Japan. She also then calls her mom and basically says, "Get me out of here now, get me home." And soon after that phone conversation, the Japanese promoter shows up, gives her a bus ticket that takes her to the airport the very next day. Joan will then play bass at the Tokyo Music Festival in her place. After that, they go home and recruit Vicky Blue, who will be their bass player. Lita Ford says they then went through bass players like toilet roll. Back at home, with the Germs' star kind of rising, the Runaways are falling apart. People start to notice it. They start... as a scene, certain people in certain bands start turning against Kim Fowley. There's some acrimony there between bands like the Weirdos and the Germs and people who are starting to see how he's kind of, manipulating the Runaways. And the Runaways themselves are starting to notice, and they're starting to get fed up with how they're being treated by him. And rumor starts coming around that Kim Fowley's trying to sell off the contract for the Runaways. Jackie Fox says Kim only wanted us to do the songs he'd written because he'd own all the publishing. The second choice was for us to do songs by people whose publishing he controlled. If you look at all our albums, Kim has written most of the songs, and the others are either written by us or by songwriters whose publishing Kim controls, like Mark Anthony and Billy Bizao. Kim owned their publishing. We started fighting with Kim so much that he turned everything over to Scott Anderson, who we mentioned earlier. Bill Aucoin, who managed Kiss, was interested, but he said, "You're going to have to get out of your contract with Kim because I'm not going to front $50,000 to get you out and then another $50,000 to work on you. You guys get rid of Kim Fowley and I'll manage you." Jackie goes on to say, "I was probably the only one who paid attention to what was going on the business side, but I was still just a 16-year-old girl. I knew we needed to get someone high-powered, and I couldn't get the band to do anything about it." Of course, Kim's take on the whole Japan situation was that, it was proof to everyone that without him there, the band would break up. Without the big bad man yelling at them all and calling them names, they wouldn't stay in line, would they? They wouldn't get along unless they were forced to. As if only Kim Fowley had the recipe to make that actually happen, right? Now back to the film to wrap up most of what I wanted to cover about the 2010 Runaways cinematographic experience. It's in Japan, kind of where we left off last time, that they experience what it's like to have insanely devoted fans from another culture. Lita Ford has mentioned how she had to buy a whole new luggage to take home all the presents she got from that trip from their Japanese fans giving them to her. And they do show the fans breaking into their hotel room or I forget if it's the backstage area, the green room where they're hanging out. They're having a relaxing time after the show and they get mobbed. They don't really convey enough of the terror, I think, that should be in that situation. I wish we could just have somebody who films The Walking Dead or the late great George Romero or somebody like that who's done zombie films to accurately portray what artists feel like when they're mobbed by Japanese fans, because 2-in-1, they all said it was terrifying, whether it was the Beatles or whether it was Iron Maiden or Runaways. That, however, will be my only criticism of the directing work of Floria Sigismondi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not, who is the director of the film. She had previously done music videos for Marilyn Manson, Justin Timberlake, Rihanna, Christina Aguilera, Leonard Cohen, Bjork, Katy Perry, David Bowie, and then tons of commercials for major brands like Nike and Target, Gucci, things like that. But also has directed television episodes of American Gods by Neil Gaiman, which to me makes perfect sense that she would have such a attention to how she wants to portray certain eras and certain colors and, you know, really be, I don't know, evocative of different times and places. Even though the timeline in this film is not all that long, she did make a conscious effort to watch a lot of films that were set in the 70s or filmed in the 70s and keep that visual style going through her own work for this. She said she wanted to keep it very raw, so she shot a lot on Super 16 and kept it kind of smoky. She wanted a bright California Valley color palette for, you know, some of the scenes that took place in the sunshine in the beginning of the film. And then it would sort of merge towards the end to be a little harder and more metallic, especially in the Japanese scenes, a little trippier. And when they come back home, things are reset to the original California visual style. Director herself has said that what I loved about the Runaways was that they were doing things that girls weren't supposed to do, especially at 15. I wanted to capture what it was like to be super young and thrown in this rock and roll world at a time when girls are just trying to figure out their bodies and create their identities. She claims she also made a very early decision that the story was going to be about Cherie and Joan. And so that was a conscious effort, you know, to kind of focus it, make it more personal on the two of them and their relationship. Let's jump from those quotes to a quote from to Lita, who was asked, were you involved with the Runaways movie? Lita says, no, I've never even seen it. Joan, Jett, and her manager, it's really their film. I don't want to see it. I think it would piss me off. I don't like drama, and I don't want it in my life. It's not in my best interest. I'm sure the movie isn't accurate. It's made to have one member in the band look better than another. I did get to read the script and gave some feedback on some things I thought were really wrong. One of the things she said was really wrong about the movie was the impetus for the band having a big blowout type breakup in Japan, where he talked in the last episode about how Lita confronted Jackie about what she saw as her lack of dedication to the band over her, family obligations and other things she was doing that made her always late for stuff or not showing up for stuff the Runaways are doing. But she takes exception to that being downplayed compared to the sort of lingerie photo shoot that was exposed to the rest of the band in Japan while they were there. The story that Cherie was given by Kim Fowley was that all the band members were posing individually in their own photo shoots. She, trusted him because his friend Brad Elterman visited each of the Runaways in their homes, but those portraits are more photojournalistic and neutral compared to these sort of girly magazine exploitative underage gal in lingerie photos. This Japanese photographer was telling her how to pose for him, and she was getting very uncomfortable. And apparently her own grandma saw what was happening while she's on all fours in front of a grown man telling her what to do with a camera and chased the photographer away with a cane. When the band finds out about this, Jackie Fox says they were furious at her. She said, 5 days went by and Lita and I wouldn't talk to her, and neither would Joan. I think the gall of it really pissed us off. Cherie tends to be by herself a lot in the video footage that survives from that Japanese press tour and the band hanging around. They're not talking to her very much. But for all this, Lita Ford says, I don't know why she made such a big fucking deal about that. I don't remember being that mad at her. I think it's just something dramatic they had to put in the movie. And it's worth noting that photos around this time feature the individual members of Runaways, scantily clad, looking like they've been put in sexy poses for that audience, that kind of thing. But it's still hard for them as people and as performers to sort of square that with the fact that they wanted to be a united front. They wanted to be like the Who or the Rolling Stones, a gang of equals, not Diana Ross and the Supremes, right? But being blonde makes you a standout in the Japanese audience. It's kind of fetishy. Japanese rock photographers definitely wanted to pounce on that and expose it as much as they could and profit from it. Now, something that's definitely left out of the documentary, Edge Play, a film about the Runaways, and the film The Runaways, is a story Lita Ford tells in her autobiography, Living Like a Runaway, a memoir. This part will get graphic, all right? So the Runaways play their final show at Budokan in Tokyo without their regular bass player, Jackie, who's gone home. And they decide Joan is the most logical choice to play bass because she knows the parts and can pull it off while singing, her parts, while Cherie sings lead vocals, obviously. Lita says this was the only show where the audience could not be contained by security guards. They went nuts. Runaway mania was in full effect, and it was awesome. After the show, as we left the dressing room, I caught my boot heel in the rolled up cuff of my pants and fell down a flight of stairs. I was hurt, but I didn't need to go to the hospital or anything like that. So I brushed it off and went back to the hotel. My back ached. I had twisted my ribs and legs in my fall down the stairs. I don't know how you twist your rib. Did you twist your ribs? I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I went to the hotel bar to get a couple shots of whiskey to kill the pain. The tour was over and Budokan show was done. What a relief. Time to celebrate. Sitting at the bar was the first American guy I had seen in a long time. So I moved closer to him, asked him where he was from, and he said he was from Texas. I think he may have been in the crew with one of the bands at the Tokyo Music Festival. I don't know if I ever knew his name. He pulled these oval-shaped pills out of his pocket, explaining they were some kind of downers called footballs. Pills like that were simply not available in Japan. I was impressed. Do you want a couple, he said. I thought, holy shit, downers, how cool. Yes, I replied, the tour is over. Let's have a fucking football. Not only did I have a few shots of whiskey, I had a couple of those footballs too. Before long, we went up to my hotel room and wound up in bed together. We had a great time, and I forgot all about tumbling down the stairs. He was fun, and the sex was hot. He was gentle with me, and afterward, we both fell asleep, probably because of the footballs. I woke up and had to pee. I looked in the toilet after I went, and it was full of blood. Immediately, I thought, okay, it's just a really heavy period. So I went back to bed. I fell asleep for another 30 minutes or so, then got up to sit on the toilet seat to see if the bleeding had stopped. But it had actually gotten worse. I looked a little closer and realized there was more blood than any normal period. Way more blood. I was full-on hemorrhaging. The toilet was filled with clotted blood. I sat back down on the bed as the Texan just lay there. The bed was covered in blood. It looked like a murder scene. The weird thing was, I wasn't in any pain, and I didn't think he had done anything to me. With that much blood, you would think I'd be in tremendous pain. I didn't accuse him of hurting me, so I told the Texan, get out. He acted confused. What? Why? I said, I don't know if you did or didn't do anything. Just get the fuck out now. I pointed to the door. He looked innocent. He truly did. But how does a person hemorrhage the way I was hemorrhaging unless someone hurt you? I didn't care what his story was. I just wanted him gone. After showing the other band members what's going on, she ends up going to the hospital, and the medical staff admitting her didn't know what was wrong with her, so they put her in the labor ward where there's like a woman screaming in the next room. She asks the doctor where she is and why that woman is screaming. She finds out that woman's having a baby. She goes, I'm in the labor ward? He says, yes. They told me I was cut open as if I'd had an episiotomy, so that was the logical place to take me. Episiotomy is a slice in a woman's perineum to make more room for a baby that is being born and does not have enough clearance otherwise to get out of the woman's body. So evidently, and according to Lita, she'd been cut somehow. Doesn't know how. She says to the doctor, make sure you stitch me up tight. Make sure everything's tight down there. The doctor understood perfectly well what I meant. He smiled. With a giggle, he said, oh, okay. He gave me 14 stitches. Because of the language barrier, I couldn't find out if it was a cut or a tear or what it was. To this day, I have no idea what happened to me. Because of the number of stitches, I assumed the Texan had cut me. I didn't feel him tearing me or hurting me. And if he had something like a cock ring, some sort of sex toy, or even a knife, I have no clue because I didn't feel any sort of pain while we were having sex. I woke up in the hospital room and saw Joan asleep in a chair next to my bed. None of the other girls had come to see me. I asked Sandy to come, but she said hospitals freaked her out. It was weird because Joan and I never really hung out together. But the instant I saw her at my bedside table in the hospital, I felt a tremendous respect for her. The Runaways were never a team, but that said a lot to me. She brought me the cassette player that Mr. Udo had given us so I could play some music in the hospital. Mr. Udo is a famous Tokyo music and live events promoter, wrestling promoter, rock promoter, whatever it is, especially if it's happening at the Budokan or Tokyo Dome. Lots of American performers have stories about Mr. Udo. From Mick Foley to Nikki Sixx. But she's laying there in the hospital recovering, listening to her cassette player while the band for the next 3 days finishes mixing and mastering the Live in Japan record. She says about 12 years later, the Texan called her. He wanted to talk about the incident in Japan, and she has no idea what he wanted to say. She just told him never to ever fucking call her again. And it really freaked her out. Nothing he said to her was going to matter. As far as she was concerned, she didn't want to know. She says, on the flight back from Japan, we were all silent, stunned, and shell-shocked. We created runaway mania, but what had just happened? Jackie was completely gone, the others were wrecked, worn out, and exhausted, and I had 14 stitches because of some dude whose name I didn't even know. I was 18 and felt like I lived an entire lifetime of adventures in 6 weeks. Technical note about the Live in Japan album. While it was being mixed and mastered, the engineer accidentally erased Joan Jett's rhythm guitar part from the song Queens of Noise. And their, I guess one of their road crew, Kent, who was traveling with them, Kent is noted by Lita as being a person who loved to aggravate folks when they're having a bad time, especially in the case of Jackie Fox when she was having her sort of mental breakdown. He did everything he could in the moment to make it worse for her and recorded it on tape with the idea that he was going to play it for Lita and they would have a good laugh, and Lita didn't want to listen to it. He's also the guy that would make things hard on their new bassist that replaced her, Vicky Blue, and Joan wasn't happy about that either, especially having understood that Vicky is joining a band that is in a complete and total chaos. The band members that are already there are medicating themselves as best they can and kind of checking out and not really very friendly with each other. Anyway, Kent at least was good for one thing. In the studio, he ran to some apartment, I guess, in the same building where they were working on the mixing of the album, found a guy who owned a Fender Stratocaster, asked him to borrow it, took it into the studio, and re-recorded Joan's parts on Queens of Noise himself. Live in Japan was meant to be a Japanese-only release, but it worked its way into other markets and ended up being a pretty big success for the Runaways. Enjoy that little nugget of truth next time you listen to it and wonder if you can hear a Fender Stratocaster that sounds out of place and not at all like the guitar that Joan Jett would normally play. Myself, I haven't gone back to listen, and I'm a little bit afraid to, just like the time someone pointed out that Ray Charles can definitely be heard singing through his dentures on What I Say. Now, you're going to hear it too. let me get back to talking more about the Runaways film itself and how it wraps up. We'll get into Joan and Lita's stories about sort of the ending of the Runaways and what happens next. And we'll get into Light of Day. The band has a big blowout fight while in the studio with Kim Fowley. Definitely counter to the stories of the women in the band about how the split occurred between Cherie and the rest of them. But a movie can only be so long. And as noted previously, this is the story mostly of Kim Fowley, Joan Jett, and Cherie Curry. Not the story of all the different members of the Runaways and what they actually did every single week between the return home from Japan and Cherie leaving the band. For a Hollywood adaptation, I'd say the depiction is fair enough to get the job done, to sever the timeline for the band. Now, I'll get into Joan's details about what she was going through at this time a little bit later. But for the movie itself, you know, they show Joan kind of recovering from the breakup after some partying, but then getting her head a little bit clearer, cleaning up a bit. You know, she's miserable for a while, then she gets it together, starts writing new songs, and they skip straight ahead to her success with I Love Rock and Roll and Crimson and Clover really fast. Definitely not showing any age on her part, any big distance between, you know, what goes on with the Runaways ending and her having a hit with I Love Rock and Roll, appearing on Rodney Bingenheimer's radio program to promote it, dressed in the same attire she would be, you know, wearing around that time, the Joan Jett and Blackheart's era, blazer and scarf and tight, you know, black pants and stuff. Though she still looks like she's in her mid-teens. Cherie gets home from the Japanese tour and then the breakup that follows. She starts to see what her twin sister's been dealing with this whole time. I think I might have called her little sister in the previous episode. That was my impression from the film, not from Cherie's notes. But I found out through Cherie's interviews that was her twin, not her little sister. So she's been changing out her dad's bedpan because their father is in terrible, terrible physical shape, can't take care of himself. I mean, he's a complete mess at the beginning of the film before Cherie goes out, you know, on tour with the Runaways. He can't drive himself home safely, and he can't crawl from the car to the front door on his own. So, teenage girl taking care of her dad, seeing to his every need. Cherie, now that she's back home, starts stealing his medication like a boss. They show this contentious, you know, studio date that comes to nothing, where they have a big fight. There's a great moment after that breakup with the band where she has a little lead singer's disease moment. Some would call it. If you're a rock guitarist, you may have heard that before. Eddie Van Halen liked using that term when it came to griping about Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth. But she does a a rock star / Karen maneuver in the liquor store, talking trash to the employees who won't sell her vodka. Goes to show that Karen phenomenon is not a new attitude. It's brought on by social media, and it's been around for a while. But then she goes to a phone booth, tries to call her sister for help, and collapses. That's mostly the end of the story for Cherie in this film. And they do a little ending, you know, title crawl type of a wrap up, like, oh, here's what they went on to do. Kim can still be seen in Hollywood every now and then running around, and Joan went on to do these solo albums and blah, 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 blah. Cherie was on, you know. I can't remember if they mentioned Cherie's foray into films. I'm sure they did. And then I can't remember if they mentioned the fact that she became like a chainsaw sculptor, you know, like a wood, like someone who carves things out of big stumps with a chainsaw many years later. But of course, instead of what the movie shows, what happened is the Runaways continue on with Joan in the lead singer's seat, playing guitar and working on new songs, putting out more material, touring with other bass players like Vicky Blue, who would go on to make the Edge play a film about the Runaways documentary that you can check out. It'll give you all the perspective from the other band members that aren't focused on with the film. There's creative tension at this time because, you know, Lita and Sandy are more heavy metal types, and they want to continue in that vein. Joan is getting more into punk rock, especially after they had gone to England for the first time, and she gets to meet Sid Vicious. She says at one point, Sid liked her S&M belt so much, like the big rings on it that hang down. He liked it so much, she just gave it to him. You can see him wearing it in a lot of famous photos. That was around Joan Jett's tiny little waist before his. She says she went to England a glitter rocker and came back a punk rocker. Oh, another note. It's funny that Cream gave them such a huge heap of shit with that terrible review of their work, you know, saying that they were all a bunch of pussies and girls couldn't rock. Under new management and leadership, the same people that ran Cream magazine would go on to publish something called Vidiot magazine in the early 80s. They featured Cherie in a sort of pinup style, not posed in a pinup style, but, you know, magazines would have pinup section, which is like a famous picture of a rock musician that you can pull out of the magazine, pin it up on your bedroom wall, supposedly. And she's just standing in front of a Missile Command game in an arcade with some terrible looking or amazing looking early 80s fake wood paneling on the walls, like the kind that was in the mobile home that my parents raised me in. And it says, Cherie Curry is a vid kid in big red letters. Let's see if I can read this at all. It says, Cherie's always been into, quote, trash culture, realizing that one person's trash is another person's art. After fronting the raunchy all-girl Runaways for several years, Cherie made waves in such motion picture gems as Foxes, which I think that's the one that had Jodie Foster in it, and the ever-tasteful Parasite. So, is it any wonder that Cherie's a vid kid? Play on, sweetheart. Photo by Michael N. Marks. She's got super early 80s hair and makeup. Like, her eyes are lavender pinkish around the sort of whatever. I don't know. I can't describe makeup, whatever. But really, really, really rougey cheeks, really red lipstick. And the hair is like, it's like that super feathered Farrah Fawcett thing, but shorter on above the ears and hanging down over the ears. And then it sort of waterfalls into just the long hair in the back. So you're like 2 scissor snips away from a mullet there. Anyway, I'm not criticizing how she looks. I'm just trying to paint a picture of the early 80s for you that says everything about the early 80s in a real trashy looking way. Maybe I will include this image in the description of this episode. Certain platforms you'll be able to see it, certain platforms not. I don't think iTunes allows the images to come through for whatever silly reason. Back to Joan's story, she talked about the fact that at the end of the Runaways, she was alone. She said, I'm trying to make my way in the world, and I just met Kenny Laguna, which would become her longtime producer. And Kenny had this idea to go over to the Who's Ramport studios and record there because he had been working with the Who for several years over there. After a week or two, we're getting pressure from my manager to sign this record deal. One day, Pete Townsend dropped by Kenny's apartment. I happened to be asleep at the time. Kenny spoke to Pete about this record deal, and Pete said it seemed shady. He told us to talk to his manager, Bill Kirbishley, because we were in their studio and worried about paying them. Bill just said, do what you got to do and pay us when you can. I thought it was so generous and wonderful. We were able to pay him back, obviously. The Who let us do Bad Reputation in their studios. I had something to play for people. So to me, it all starts right there with The Who. About 3 years or so after making Bad Reputation in the studio, we opened for The Who. I remember Roger got down on one knee and sang Happy Birthday to me backstage one day. Thought that was kind of a cool little note there. That's where things would eventually get to in a bit later in the timeline. I'm going to backtrack some more because I can't help but do things out of order. In real life, when they came back from Japan, there was only a certain amount of time they had left working with Kim Fowley. Due to disagreements over money and the management of the band, the Runaways and Kim Fowley parted ways in 1977. They quickly hired Toby Mamis, who worked for Blondie and Suzi Quatro. So that's a pretty damn good pedigree when it comes to working with a group like the Runaways. When they split from Fowley, they also parted with their record label, Mercury/Polygram, who had their deal tied up, their record deal. In the Edge Play documentary, members of the band, especially Jackie Fox and Cherie Currie, as well as parents of Sandy West and Cherie Currie, accused Fowley and others assigned to look after the band of broken promises as to, the schooling aspect of their lives that he was supposed to be taking care of, and other kinds of care, using divide and conquer tactics to keep control of the band, along with the verbal taunting of band members. They reportedly spent a lot of time enjoying the excesses of the rock and roll lifestyle during this era, partnered with Thin Lizzy producer John Alcock after Joan Jett's future producer partner Kenny Laguna turned down the job to record their last album, and now The Runaways. And this album came after they did Waiting for the Night, which was their fourth album, and they got to go tour for the Ramones, or support for the Ramones. And I mentioned that because I had forgotten to mention this previously. It's a little anecdote I wanted to go back to. This is straight out of Lita's autobiography, Living Like a Runaway. The first show of the tour with the Ramones was on January 7, 1978 at the Palladium in New York. The dressing rooms in that place were small, and I remember seeing Joey Ramone changing his clothes. He had a huge scar down his back, and I wondered what had happened to him, although I never asked. He had all sorts of health issues, and he used a lot of nose spray to breathe and eye drops to see. He had a beautiful girlfriend from L.A. At the time, I wondered how a guy like Joey could get such a hot chick, but when you saw him on stage, you figured it out. I started to love him too. I started to love all the Ramones. I loved the way they all wore matching clothes and moved together, strumming their guitars in synchronicity. I knew every word to their set. They were very street, very tough, raunchy, and raw. The Ramones were like street rats with attitude on a rock and roll level. I became friends with Joey's girlfriend. The only time I shot heroin was with her, when she injected it into one of my butt cheeks. It made me so sick, I threw up on the front lawn of her house. It was a disaster. Never again. I'm definitely not cut out for heroin. It was never my drug of choice. Now, to talk about Lita's take on the John Alcott production era, their last album, the English producer that they really, really admired and who liked heavy metal kind of sounds and was really, interested in Sandy and Lita's playing and not that much else when it comes to the rest of the band members. But Sandy and Lita had a good time making that record. Although Lita says for her part, she doesn't remember which album he actually produced in in one of the interviews I saw. But she does recall Sandy vomiting banana daiquiri all over the living room of John Alcott and his phone. And waking up the next day, Lita tries to use the phone and it's all sticky because it's covered in banana daiquiri vomit. Thank you, Sandy. Sandy, for her part, talks about the fact that he manipulated her a lot, focused so much attention on her that she would trust him, and he kind of fawned over her and made her feel special so he could try to move in on her physically. Everywhere these gals go, there's always a man trying to take advantage of them, evidently. Jesus Christ. I don't know what it's like to grow up a woman, but holy balls. If I had gone through so much manipulation and terrorizing from my manager and then being physically manipulated by producers and told that I suck for being a girl that tries to play rock and roll music by the press and other bands. And on top of that, I'm in some cases, depending on which runaway you're talking about, being the breadwinner for my family and taking care of my alcoholic mess of a father, or like other runaways, just dealing with absentee parents that don't know how to be parents. Male authority figures telling you can't do this music thing, or you can't play rock and roll guitar because girls don't do that. How could you not come out of this saying, as soon as I have enough money, I'm never talking to a man again for the rest of my life? But they don't. They don't do that. They don't turn into sexist pigs. Sexist pigs are the ones that made their lives miserable for doing nothing wrong, for doing nothing of any offense to men. Isn't that funny how the world works? I'm not going to digress on this too much longer, but it bears repeating. I don't know that I could go through experiences like that and not have preconceived notions about every man I ever met from that point out based on previous trauma or stress and anxiety they caused me. But no, they continue to make music with men, be in the music business with men, trust them with their finances and business partnerships, and then other men that don't even know them are adopting the prevailing attitude of the late 70s, early 80s, which is that women that are full of attitude or tough or, a little aggressive and confrontational that stand up for themselves are nothing more than lesbians or dykes or man haters. And they just need a man like them to bring them around to being, subservient. This is the prevailing attitude of most guys at that time in just sort of American culture. If you're of an age that is, out scoping for chicks, cruising around, trying to meet women's. I mean, even as late as the early 2000s, there was a incredibly popular morning radio show host on the main rock station in Seattle, Washington, that would just scream about the women's basketball team here in Seattle every goddamn day because it defied gender norms. And he didn't want there to be a basketball team for women in Seattle. I still to this day don't understand what the big deal was. But not that he didn't want to go, not that he didn't want to support it, but those women shouldn't be doing that, and we shouldn't have this team. I know that sounds tangential, but it's not. I'm saying 2004, 2005, okay? That's the tail end of a lot of this blatant sexism. Imagine what it was like in the late 70s if you're a young woman in the Runaways, for crying out loud. Anyways, back to the making of the record. According to Lita, who admits that before they even made the album, most of them were really fucked up. So even before the John Alcott era, they were getting wasted all the time, not getting along, not remembering a lot. And it just snowballs from there. Everyone's using more drugs, alcohol. Everyone's getting more fucked up. And the Runaways start to disintegrate. Time to jump across the timeline some more. This is like a Marvel Comics Infinity Gauntlet crossover style summer spectacular event where we got to jump from the point of view of different heroes and villains and see how things happen from their side of things at different points in time. It's too much to keep all together in chronological order, and I thank you for sticking with me through it all, doing it my way in this really catch-as-catch-can sort of fashion. Carrying on. Joan, when she takes over the leadership role, she's not taking any shit from reporters or any crowds asking for songs that were sung by Cherie. They make an album that rocks a bit harder, but the producer drives another wedge in between members of the band. Definitely Sandy and Joan, for sure. She refuses, from her point of view, she refused to be fired from a band she helped put together, but also refused to walk on eggshells about it. So she leaves, starts drinking heavily, gets depressed, parties too much, develops a heart infection, and then had to be taken to Cedars-Sinai by her good friend Lisa. After recovering, Jones finds out the Runaways are still contractually obligated to record 6 songs for a soundtrack. She ends up working on it for about 8 days with a new producer. It was called Dub Beat O, Dubeat-O. Some kind of a weird porno movie, supposedly. But that wasn't the only film she did music for, apparently. She was working on something called We're All Crazy Now, Crazee, but that was actually a film that was supposed to be loosely based on the Runaways' career. This is according to Kenny Laguna, producer and manager for Joan Jett. He said, I love Joni, but never wanted to be her manager. But she became a cause because she was so fantastic and no label would take her on. After that aforementioned heart infection and the hospitalization for it, Joan goes to Europe, puts out a debut self-titled record, but back in the States, 23 different record labels rejected it. So Kenny Laguna and Joan Jett form an independent label called Blackheart Records, release it themselves. They sell it out of the trunk of his car at shows that she's playing. And he says, we couldn't think of anything else to do but print it up ourselves. And that's how Blackheart Records started. It was more or less Joan's idea to do it. And I believe it's around this time that they did I Love Rock and Roll, which Joan did not write, but she did suggest the Runaways cover it, according to her documentary, if I'm remembering that part correctly. And they didn't want to do it, so she hung on to it until it was time for her own solo career to take off. The Bad Reputation is the big one that really establishes her and her attitude apart from the Runaways past. You know, especially the lyrics of that one. A girl can do what she wants to do, and that's what I'm going to do. I don't really care if you think I'm strange. I ain't going to change. Never said I wanted to improve my station. I want to feel good when I'm having fun, and I don't have to feed no one. Never been afraid of any deviation. All that stuff. All that just the rebelliousness of just saying you're a person that has the same rights and wants and as any individual should have, despite the fact that you're a woman. The fact that that is so transgressive for the time really should give us pause. Of course, Joan's going to go on to champion a lot of women's causes for choice, for self-defense, abortion rights, and the rights for women to defend themselves is what I'm talking about. Anti-rape causes. There's a leather jacket of hers with pins all over it in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And these are old looking pins. They're not like they were just stuck on there to make a point about something. These have been worn and they're, scratched up and worn out. It says, one says rock for choice. One says pro fucking choice. One says Women's Action Coalition. One says keep abortion legal. One says if she says no, it's rape. And can you guess how supportive the comments from aging classic rock cranks are? One nice guy says, saw her this summer at Surf Ballroom. She was great. And then an asshole response is, so is Michael Jackson, the pedophile. Someone says, nothing says rebel like lesbians killing kids. Rock on. I love it. And then a response to that, interesting that lesbian relationships have the highest percentage of domestic violence and there are no men involved. A response to him is, liberal women, typical, chose conservative men, even they don't want soy boys. One commenter requests that the poster of this photograph says, he requests of the poster of the photograph, find me pictures of her wearing those pins and patches with those, quote, beliefs, unquote, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And then a response less than a day later. I'm still waiting for proof she wore that bling on stage or any time during her career. I'll wait. So divisive. So confrontational of her to wear pins on her person that support causes she cares about for keeping women safe and, not taking away their rights to do certain things, whether or not you agree with it, just to wear them walking around or on stage or in photographs. Jesus. And I don't think it's right to talk about her career and her life and her motivations for what she does and why she writes the way she writes. I mean, I'm tying this into her lyrical declarations of what it is to be her and how she rebels by just pointing out how she feels and how she wants to live as a human being. It features prominently in the documentary about her. Bad Reputation. Michael J. Fox, who worked with her on Light of Day, of course, which we're about to get into soon, talks about the fact that she's always been supportive of LGBT oriented causes and women's causes, feminist causes. But unlike other people, he points out, other famous people, he likes to point out, she's never been fluffy about it. She says, she says, this is how it should be, and fuck you if you don't like it. So I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but man, if you love Joan Jett, watch the documentary Bad Reputation. You'll get a lot of cool glimpses into her life and career. Later in her career in the 90s, she got into some really interesting creative partnerships with people that were more associated with like the Riot Girl movement. She said seeing L7 perform was a religious experience for her. She played with L7 at a Rock for Choice show, which is, if you can't infer what it's about, it was in the 90s a charity support, funding system for women's abortion rights. She would also join up with the surviving members of the punk band from Seattle called the Gits, whose lead singer Mia Zapata was raped and murdered in the mid-1990s in Seattle. She performed as the singer, guitarist in that band, to help raise money for a private investigator to keep the case going. Eventually, after many, many years, after genetic, evidence, DNA evidence became easier to process and use for proof in court cases, the case was reopened because of all of their efforts and all their time spent and all their money spent over the years. And the rapist and murderer who killed Mia Zapata was finally convicted. Joan would go on to team up with Kathleen Hanna of the band Bikini Kill and produce some singles for that band. Also, Hanna would end up writing songs for Joan's 1994 album Pure and Simple. And to backtrack a little bit in her career, she, in 1988, had a big hit with I Hate Myself for Loving You. It was on the Billboard charts, peaking at number 8 at the exact same time that her former bandmate Lita Ford was at number 12 for Kiss Me Deadly. To wrap up a few notes on bass players for the Runaways, it was Vicky Blue that came in, auditioned for the Runaways after Jackie Fox left the band in the summer of 77. She did very well in the audition, enough to become their new bassist and play on their 4th studio album, Waiting for the Night, and then tour with them from fall 77 to late 1978. She left the band when they started recording And Now, the Runaways, but was still credited for playing bass on that album, even though she did not. She went on to sing backup vocals on the girls' school album Play Dirty that came out in 1983. Laurie McAllister took over bass playing in 1978 with the Runaways. Played their last show with them on New Year's Eve that year in San Francisco. Now, let's talk about Jackie Fox again. I was tearing through this book called They Just Seem a Little Weird by Doug Broad, B-R-O-D. How Kiss, Cheap Trick, Aerosmith, and Stars remade rock and roll. There are 2 sections of this book that mention Jackie Fox, and I have to use that for this episode, of course. Before she became the bassist for the Runaways, Jackie Fox attended the taping of Kiss's performance on NBC's Midnight Special in L.A. in 75. Barged into their dressing room and introduced herself since she wanted to be in a band so badly and had no idea how to go about starting one. Because Jackie says that was something girls did not do. She discovered Kiss instantly, became a fan when a school friend showed her the cover of their debut album. After taking the record home and giving it a listen, she had an epiphany. I can play this. That, to her, was a big part of Kiss's appeal. As a teenage musician without a whole lot of training, they made me want to get up and rock, she says. They also made me think that I could do that. Then I saw them, and they're still the most dynamic live act I've ever seen. For her, the crudeness of their words never mattered. She goes, the songs were nonsensical. Get up and get your grandma out of here. What the fuck does that mean? I've often wondered myself, Jackie. That's probably one of the best Kiss songs ever written, too. She says, you weren't listening to the lyrics. You were just listening to the rhythm. You were getting into Paul and Gene doing that back and forth rocking thing. You were watching somebody walk around in gigantic heels. It's hard to believe now, but there was something dark and menacing about them that was really cool. I never really thought about gender. It wasn't like the Rolling Stones. You listen to the Stones, you thought about gender. You heard Under My Thumb, the squirming dog who just had her day. That made you feel icky. So she also talks about going to the Starwood a lot at this time, where one side of the club would have a DJ playing rock music, and then the other side would have live bands performing. And she says they used to come in all the time, no makeup, but you knew it was them because they were wearing Kiss jackets. It was, I don't want to be recognized, but I do want to be recognized. So she and her friend go talk to Paul Stanley, who's like at the edge of the dance floor watching other people doing their thing. And Trampled Underfoot by Led Zeppelin is playing out of the speakers. And the girls are like, come on down and dance with us. And Jackie says, he looked at us and said, I want to dance with you, but not to this. Then we went, okay, and started dancing. It wasn't something that you would think of as a great dance song, but still. She says this was spring of 75 because that was the same night at the Starwood, according to her, that Rodney Bingenheimer came up to her and asked if she played an instrument. Then she said yes, and he introduces her to Kim Fowley. And the rest, of course, is history. When she goes to audition to play lead guitar initially with the Runaways, the only song all three of them knew was Kiss's Strutter. It didn't really work out at that audition. But when she did get in as their bass player later, each of the five girls in the band adopted the persona of their idols. Jett modeled herself on Susie Quatro, Cherie on David Bowie. Fox was the Gene Simmons of the group. Now, scooching ahead just 2 years, according to this same book, they just seem a little weird. In early 77, Jackie Fox was nearing the end of her run in the Runaways, run in the Runaways. Jackie is trying to attract the attention of the people that are making Kiss and Aerosmith so successful. So she spends her last $600 to fly out to New York and convince Jack Douglas to produce her band, because he had done Aerosmith, and Bill Aucoin, who managed Kiss, to manage Runaways. She speaks on the phone to Douglas, who agreed to executive produce an album and suggested as producer his associate, Eddie Leonetti, whom Jackie Fox says she loved because his name always sounded like it was three people, two of whom were named Eddie. She meets with Bill Aucoin. He tells her he wanted to take them on, but it would cost him $50,000 to buy out their manager, Kim Fowley, who had helped out with songs on Destroyer, which is obviously the biggest selling Kiss record of that time, who he manages. And he'd have to sink another $50,000 into the band. So he says, get rid of Kim Fowley first, and then I'll manage you. Jackie says she brought that conversation back to the band. And according to her, at that point, they were all just wasted and apathetic. So that never happened. Boy, what could have been, huh? Imagine Runaways with the firepower of Bill Aucoin and Jack Douglas in the late 70s, just totally committing to getting them out from under the boot heel of Kim Fowley, this crazed, domineering, creep pervert guy that's just controlling everything and slanging deals left and right and pocketing most of the money for himself. Let's not forget that rock and rollers were a trashy commodity all through the first couple of, 2-3 decades of the industry treatment of rock and roll musicians. I mean, not that they weren't treated like garbage in the 80s and 90s too, but I think artists were seen as a lot more disposable for a long, long time. The Beatles and David Bowie were probably off the top of my head, not the be all end all, don't come at me, but they were the ones that really did solidify the notion in the public's mind of an entrepreneurial artist in charge of their own career through more than one phase of being famous and influential. most of everybody else is just getting chewed up and spit out. And yeah, what are you going to do about it? Sue us? Ha ha ha. You don't have any money. I've got all your money. Bye. I'm going to find a new, young, talented person that's dying to be famous, get them to wash my balls and do whatever drugs I give them, and then take their money too. I think that's in the big book of how to run things in the music business. I think that's the actual title. And hey, speaking of the way that rock musicians were treated in the past, and specifically female performers in rock and roll treated in the past, if you don't like the way I do this, with all my randomness and jumping around and blatantly just reading straight out of the life stories of other people, you're certainly welcome to go listen to the podcasts like the one that usually comes up ahead of mine when you search for mine by title, because it's, I guess, more established and been around a lot longer. I actually checked it out once so far when I was doing my Janis Joplin episode. And before I did these Runaways episodes, because I was feeling like maybe I'd check out how other podcasts were approaching the history of important female rock and roll musicians, and just for comparison, or see if I'm about to say something they've already said. Well, no, definitely not, because it was just two guys sitting around together casually listing the names of rock and roll performers that were female and like the years they recorded at, maybe the title of an album or a single here and there, and just saying things like, oh, she was so awesome. Oh, she was so important. So important. Yeah. And then there was so-and-so. And that's what's out there besides this. Just know they're always there for you. Now, to offset all the randomness and to the attention I've mostly paid, I would say overwhelmingly more to Joan Jett than other members of the Runaways over the course of this last 2 Runaways episodes, I am going to segue a little bit. There's no way to do a little bit of segue. This is segueing, committing to, totally into a large portion of Lita Ford content now. We're going to do a little peek into some experiences she had via her memoirs that I will be pulling details from and masterfully interpreting them in my own way so as not to feel guilty about just blatantly reading copywritten material on my own podcast. Though there's lots of those out there too if you want it. We've been going at this pretty hard for a little while now. I understand if you want to get up and stretch, go to the refrigerator, pour a beverage, do some squats. I'm slowly realizing this week that I'm probably going to have to get on Twitter and promote this show. The series, I mean, not this particular episode. Yes, this particular episode, too. Oh, it's full of psychopaths, though. But nobody's finding this shit on Instagram so far. People need to find this podcast, damn it. Somebody's got to hear all these unused guitar demos I recorded during the pandemic and had no band or song to force them into. So both Lita and Joan, in their solo careers, especially mid-'80s, around that time, would definitely be served well by their experience in the Runaways and their training by the incredibly manipulative and mean-spirited and abusive Kim Fowley, because they were going to come up against a lot of abuse and a lot of manipulation from a lot of different people in the industry, of course, but it wouldn't be probably to them as bad as the same guy every fucking day for a few years, the guy that was controlling their careers. Lita talks about touring with bands like Dokken, getting shit from George Lynch. George Lynch is a guy that has a bad reputation for being a real asshole all through the 80s and some of the 90s. I can only say I've never met him, but I've talked to people that have worked shows, and sound engineers and things locally in more recent years, and had nothing but nice things to say about the fella. And I totally believe that. I'm sure lots of people that were full of attitude in the 80s mellowed out and got a little bit more easy to deal with after the money and the fame dried up. And it was time to, self-release a whole bunch of albums. Maybe not self-release, but, go underground a bit when you used to be selling out arenas. And attitude adjustments happen. Also, people grow up. People mellow out. I went to a luthier school in Arizona back in 2000, and they told us that, they send new guitar techs to George all the time, and they last about a week to a month. Maybe that was an exaggeration. And even that was 21 years ago. Good Lord. Who even knows what he's like now? Lots of people, Jay. Lots of people probably know what he's like right now. Anyway, according to Lita, he was one of the worst offenders when it came to sexist people that were trying to, get the message to her that women don't play guitar, evidently. And would pull all kinds of shit. Him and his crew would pull shit on her when they were touring together. She was opening for Dawkins, I guess. They'd remove, they'd pull a tube from her amplifier. And if you don't know what that means it's like taking the battery out of your car, essentially, except for, you need to be able to use that car in front of a lot of people and not look like an asshole. She talked about impressing a lot of people that were naysayers at that time who couldn't believe that a girl would be able to play guitar solos. Shock, horror. And, there was a time when her friend and guitar tech, Tony, and guitar tech, for anyone that doesn't know, is someone that carries your gear, helps set up your amplifiers, plugs everything in, checks your equipment before a show, tunes your guitars, restrings your guitars, maintains your guitars, which is a very involved job. Also, the person that picks all that stuff up after you're done. So you're the first one there and the last one to leave. Not easy rock star life. So a lot of times, guitar techs are people that watch the entire show and are manipulating your sound on stage while you're playing as well through various switches and buttons and boxes and Star Trek effects or whatever, depending on who's paying you to do what. Anyway, after a performance of Lita's, Tony is, cabling everything up. She's packing up guitar cables and stuff, and someone says to her, "Hey, those are my cables." And Tony says, "No, these are mine. These are my cables." Lita says she always kept an eye on everything because we had our gear sabotaged several times before. Tony had no idea who this guy was until he announced he was George Lynch from Dawkins. And Tony says to him, "You want to know why I know they're ours?" She unscrews the end of the cable where the plug is, the part that plugs into your amplifier, your guitar, the little silver tipped bit. There's like a barrel sort of behind it where you can unscrew this casing. Think about a bullet. Think about a bullet casing. If you don't know guitars, if you don't know audio equipment, and you do know guns and bullets. If you don't know bullets, I don't know. Think of something else with the tip and an unscrewable back piece. You unscrew this bit, and that's the sort of housing that shields and protects the very sort of delicate connection between the plug and the copper wiring, braided copper wiring that can easily get damaged and ruin your whole night if something terrible happens to that connection. You have no sound if that happens. And lots of people, they damage that part of their cable and they think their whole guitar is broken forever if they don't understand how that stuff works. Luckily, it's usually just, a $10 to $50 purchase to get a new cable. Or if you're a cheap bastard that knows too much like me, you chop it off and re-solder it. Anyhow, she unscrews the housing there and shows Lynch the writing inside the cabling underneath that says LF for Lita Ford. Like a true friend, Tony had these cables specially made for Lita before they even went on tour and went inside all of them, unscrewed the plugs, and wrote Lita's initials on them with black Sharpie inside every single cable. That's so beautiful. I love that so much. It makes me so happy. God damn it. Technical know-how mixed with friendship equals unstoppable rock and roll, people. Now, that's a general sort of a way that she benefits from all the abuse from the Runaways days. But here's a specific one. And we talked in the previous episode about how, and in the film, The Runaways, the gals would have some training, some boot camp training with people throwing things at them while they were trying to rehearse. Lita was very specific about how she had her lights run during her shows, even this early on. She says, I always had the lighting director turn the spotlights down so I wasn't blind. That way I could see if anything was coming at me and I could dodge it. I fucking love that. She goes, at one show, a guy was standing directly in front of me, his chest pushed up against the stage. He didn't know I was watching him. He had a can of beer. He shook it up hard so that it would explode all over me. As he held the can up toward my guitar, ready to open the beer, I kicked him in the wrist as hard as I could. I wouldn't be surprised if I broke his wrist. He was gone soon after that, fucking prick. I don't think he saw that one coming. The beer went flying backward away from me and over the top of the crowded room. But she goes on to say, the girlfriends of boys who were digging me frightened me the most. Experience taught me to always be on guard. Watching out to avoid being hit in the face with something tossed by a jealous girlfriend. I was worried a woman might want to bring my looks down a notch by throwing an ashtray or a broken beer bottle at me. I may sound paranoid, but I had to be prepared for that kind of shit. Even when your back is turned, you have to be aware of what's behind you. This is all shit you have to have in the back of your mind when you're on stage. Anyone that doesn't believe that, please do a little research on Daryl, Dimebag, +, Ohio. Thanks again for jumping around in the timeline with me. The Infinity Gauntlet alternate universe timeline. Okay, was it Infinity War? Actually, Civil War. It's more like the Marvel Civil War timeline because it jumps around, from one person's perspective to another person's perspective about similar events or concordant events or concurrent events. Okay, I should also say I never read Infinity Gauntlet or Infinity War. I looked at the covers when they came out. I flipped through the pages. I saw the art, the super cool art. The Silver Surfer artwork was the best it's been since Jack Kirby era. I've never purchased a Silver Surfer comic book in my entire life. But I know Dave Sim? No, Dave Sim's the guy that did Cerebus and took a lot of acid and started hating women. Ron Lim? Was it Ron Sim or Ron Lim that was the artist for the Infinity Gauntlet? Anyway, he ruled for the cosmic stuff in the 90s Marvel. So back around 1979, according to the book We Got the Neutron Bomb, the Germs were going in the studio with Joan Jett producing an album with them. Joan says, when they were ready to record, the Germs asked me if I would produce, and I took it real seriously. I really wanted to do a good job, except we partied a lot. At one point, I passed out, and Darby Crash, the singer, wrote about it in one of the songs, Shut Down. He mentioned I was passed out on the couch, and I was, but only for that one song. They'd been playing around LA for a few years by then, so they'd worked up their songs. They were really tight. Their album was basically their set list. I just had them set up, and I told Darby to sing like he was on stage, except right into the mic, rather than separating him and having him sing to a track. and then Pat Burnett rolled tape. And what she's saying is it's more of a live, band's all recording at the same time, and they got the energy going in the studio together as opposed to isolating them and having them do their parts. I record drums together with the bass maybe, and then the guitarist comes in and sits down and does his part, and then the singer comes in, does his part at another day, another time, or whatever. Joan thinks she captures the energy on that record of the band really well. She says it was pretty straightforward. There wasn't the time or budget or the technology for it to be anything other than, the way it came out. Sure, I doubled tracks here and there and had them do things they'd never done before. I had Darby doing harmonies. Darby took it pretty seriously. We didn't have to do a lot of takes. He was certainly not out of control in the studio. He respected me. Did what I asked him to do. They were trying to get something done, and they were very serious about it. It was a controlled nuttiness at that point. Don Bolles would say that Pat Burnett, the engineer on that, was actually kind of an uncredited co-producer with Joan, although he mentions Pat Smear knew exactly what he wanted his guitar to sound like, so everybody's pitching in at one point, and Joan was very cool and open to all suggestions. Joan is a rock goddess. She understood rock and roll. Darby knew he could never capture what he had on stage. We all drank a little, but we stayed incredibly focused. We were a hard-working little unit determined not to fuck it up. I'm sure it must have been quite touching to watch the Germs toiling away with such dedication to do the best we possibly could. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The result was pretty much what we were trying to do, just getting down on tape who we thought we were with some professional guidance from Joan and Pat Burnett. And if your ears perked up at the mention of Pat Smear and you're not aware of who the Germs are or were, Pat Smear, most people would know today from Foo Fighters, and previously to that, Nirvana, from the recording or the touring after In Utero came out onward through their unplugged performance, things like that. Pat was there as their second guitarist. The band had a lot of respect for him because he'd been in the Germs back in the day, and they were happy to have somebody with that kind of experience and credibility to probably bring a little, I don't know, hopefully some stability into the remaining years of Nirvana's existence. And I digressed into that little note about, back in 79, and what she was doing with the Germs, just to keep broadening the picture in your head of what Joan Jett has been responsible for and what she has been capable of accomplishing in her career compared to other people from her era, let alone other people in her band that, let's say, unfortunately had very sad lives or went on to go to prison instead of continuing to play music. There's quite a range of experiences there. I would say, to me, Joan and Lita were the most productive folks in music. Jackie went on to other endeavors and was very successful after going to law school and things like that. And Cherie obviously dabbled in some acting and some other creative endeavors, but didn't parlay that Runaways experience as a front woman or front person into fronting another long-term band concern like I think she could have if it weren't for maybe some personal issues. I don't know what she went through for the rest of her life. I can't read everybody's biography or autobiography, unfortunately, but admittedly, a lot of her perspective is up there on the screen in the Runaways movie from at least that era. I also don't want to read any musician's autobiography about the times when they weren't in the bands that I care about. I've lost too many years of my life to that, and I don't know how much time I've got left. When I reread John Densmore's Riders on the Storm, I'm not going to read about his brother and his fiance or wife or girlfriend and their mushroom trips in the years after the Doors. And that episode is on its way as well. Okay, no more talk about the Runaways movie in this episode. I think we're done with that. Let's talk about Light of Day, written and directed by Paul Schrader, the man who brought us Taxi Driver, among many other films, but that's the big standout that he kind of made his bones with, I would say, and had the biggest cultural impact. Now, this is a rough one. If you are looking for a fun rock and roll movie with Michael J. Fox and Joan Jett and Michael McKean, oh boy, it is a depressing, dark, tense family drama with rock and roll in there, and well represented rock and roll scenes too. It's the most depressing, hard to deal with parts of being in a band. They're all there, and it's like it takes place in Cleveland. It it has a lot of just scenes in bars where the band members are hanging around, drinking beer, smoking cigarettes, having arguments. The character of Patty is played by Joan Jett. She is like really on Michael J. Fox and Michael McKean to help her steal enough shit to sell at pawn shops so that they can buy a PV mixing board, like a powered mixer. I don't know what kind of a deal Hartley Peavey had with the people making this movie, or if he just knows Paul Schrader or knew Paul Schrader personally and professionally. Because they say, like, Joan Jett says the word Peavey like 5 times in 2 different scenes in this film. She uses it like you would say Kleenex instead of tissue paper. She says it instead of mixing boards. They say mixer or mixing board once or twice, but she says Peavey mixing board. The Peavey. We got to get the Peavey, and then that'll take care of all of our problems. And there's really uncomfortable scenes where they're just sitting in the neighborhood at night with the lights off in the car, waiting for someone to leave their house so they can break in and steal a bunch of tools. And eventually Michael J. Fox bails and gets out of there. And Patty sticks around, and she goes in, she pulls it off. And then Michael J. Fox gets confronted at work the following week by the brother-in-law of the guy they ripped off, and he makes some pretty serious implied physical threats about what's going to happen if they don't get their money back and those tools back. It's rough to be in a band, and especially when you're a freaking grown-up with a kid, and then you make it worse by participating in crimes. Didn't anyone ever tell you, Joan Jett, that crime does not pay? There's also uncomfortable scenes when they're on the road and she's got her little kid with her and a skeezy boyfriend, and the skeezy boyfriend and Joan Jett are, using the child as a vehicle to shoplift things from the grocery store. So then they get back to their motel for the night where the band is staying. She gets to be the hero and say, "Hey, I got us all steaks. Woo! Oh, Patty, you're the best." And then Michael J. Fox gets severely pissed off at the boyfriend and at her for what they did, involving the child in this little shoplifting scheme. Their characters are brother and sister, and they've been playing in this bar band together for a while. Patty gets frustrated with the dead-end situation of it all and ends up getting in a fight with Michael J. Fox's. I forgot his character's name. It's Michael J. Fox. And splits off, goes off and tries to do a bunch of more out there extreme kind of stuff for the time, or for mainstream rock, while everyone else is doing Rust Belt, middle of the road hard rock and roll for roadhouses and stuff. At one point, an alarm clock goes off and one of the characters wakes up to the song Cleveland Rocks. All the little chicks with the crimson lips say Cleveland Rocks. Cleveland Rocks, which you may know as the theme song to the Drew Carey show back in the mid and late 90s. So whoever wrote that obviously wrote it back in the 80s or somewhere around there, and it was used in this film first. I don't know who recorded it. I didn't really look it up. I don't care. It's pure luck or knowing somebody important, I would suppose, that they got their song placed in this movie and then placed in that show, and they got paid a lot of money. I hope. Please tell me they got paid money. Anyone that gets paid money that makes music and writes and records songs, I'm happy for you. I don't begrudge anybody. I don't care what it is anymore. I care how good or bad it is. But what I'm getting to is it's a solidly North Midwestern setting. It's a solidly blue-collar working class setting and group of people. There's, one of the bigger concerns in the timeline of this film, besides the family stuff and the band stuff, is the economy, is, the factory or the plant where Michael McKean and Michael J. Fox work has to lay a lot of people off. They eventually, come back to work, I guess, a little bit part-time later in the movie. They do have time to go have fun, do exciting little fun rock and roll dalliances, like going to a Fabulous Thunderbirds concert at the local large theater or small arena. I don't know what kind of deal, to be conspiratorial again. Not really. I mean, everyone's got to make their money in the entertainment business however they can. But I don't know what kind of deal the Fabulous Thunderbirds had in the 80s with makers of cinematographic film, but it must have been good because they're not that exciting of a band. I know they were big hot shit in Texas, and Stevie Ray Vaughan felt like his older brother was more successful than him for pretty much most of their lives before his untimely and unfortunate death. But I don't get it. They were, to me, my opinion, fairly mediocre old guy band of middle of the road blues-ish rock stuff. I think Huey Lewis and the News is like the Ramones compared to Fabulous Thunderbirds. Anyhow, I say all this because Jimmy Vaughn from the Fabulous Thunderbirds was in, if you've heard my first couple episodes of this history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll, the movie Great Balls of Fire, playing in Dennis Quaid's band, Dennis Quaid being the person who is performing as Jerry Lee Lewis. Even though Jerry Lee is not famous for having like an ongoing electric guitar player that was at all the sessions and at all the shows and a real hardcore member of his crew necessarily. I didn't read much talk about that. It's usually the bass player and the drummer that you see, maybe hear a little bit about from time to time. So he got in that movie, and then he gets the Fabulous Thunderbirds in this movie, and they did the theme song for the movie. I think it was called Tough Guys. Burt Lancaster and the elder Douglas, the Kirk Douglas, in the late 1980s, around the same time as these other two movies. Tough Guys, I think it was about two. Yeah, these two guys get out of prison and they go like rob a train. They're tough enough. Like Fabulous Thunderbirds, not nearly as interesting as ZZ Top. Can we agree on that? Okay. Not as much fun as Huey Lewis and the News. But speaking of other musicians, the main title song for this was written by Bruce Springsteen. Paul Schrader wanted him to be in the movie. He said no, just as he was recruited by Stephen King to be in Maximum Overdrive, and he said no. And he was recruited to be in the movie Eddie and the Cruisers, and he said no. If you want to check out the song, of course, there's the obvious soundtrack version of it, but if you're super into Joan Jett, you could do a lot worse than checking out YouTube videos that show her performing it live with Bruce Springsteen at a benefit concert. I believe it was a post 9/11 kind of a fundraiser thing in the early 2000s. And then there's one for Michael J. Fox's induction into, I believe it's like a Canadian Lifetime Achievement Hall of Fame type of a ceremony. She flew all the way up to Canada to do that show in like one day. I think she was in Texas or something the day before and had her own gigs to play right after that. And it's a great recording of her appearing on stage with Michael J. Fox, even at his age and dealing with the sort of advanced life changes of having medical issues that he's had for a good 20, 30 years or more. He looks like he's having a blast playing guitar with Joan Jett. And I have to admit, it was very heartwarming to hear what she had to say on stage for that performance about how nice he was to her on the set, even though she'd never acted before. Another note about this movie in regards to other musicians that you don't think might be directly connected. This is the film that brought us the first on-screen celluloid presence of one young Mr. Trent Reznor, who would obviously go on to start the band Marilyn Manson. I kid. This is before he formed Nine Inch Nails. He was still living in the Cleveland area, playing in a bunch of, a string of local bands. He was sort of known as the best keyboard guy around and was getting paid gigs, but realized he was not going anywhere with his own style of music. He wasn't innovating anything. He wasn't inspired. He was just a go-to guy to sort of help other people's, music along. So he pretty soon after this era scooched the fuck out of there and got on with the creation of Nine Inch Nails, the early demos that he was doing, playing club gigs with other musicians, realizing that he would sort of take the same approach of just finding other people to do the parts he would write for them. But in this film, he's a member of the band called The Problems, with Mark Addison, Frank Vale being the other two members of the band. They're on stage for all of about like 6 seconds, and they look very uptight. You can barely tell it's Trent Reznor. But if I was to point it out to you, you'd go, oh, yeah, I bet. Okay, I believe it. That's him. Now, as I said, if you like tense family dramas, this movie is for you. I will not do what I usually do, which is talk openly about all the details of the plot of the film, because I kind of don't want to wreck the outcome of this one for you if you intend to watch it. I will say I understand now why I didn't like it as a kid. My parents thought it'd be a slam dunk if they rented this movie, because I kind of worshipped all rock and roll guitar when I was a little kid because of the movie Back to the Future. So I definitely worshipped at the altar of Michael J. Fox as a little dude trying to be cool like him. And this is not a cool, badass rock and roll movie as much as it is a someone in the family's dying of cancer movie. Is what it ends up becoming, and I'm still not really blowing it for you. There was a string of these in the late 80s and early 90s. Maybe Paul Schrader was the innovator of them. I'll give him that credit if that's the case. I certainly don't think he took the idea for this film from anyone else. I think this is a very personal film for him. It feels like it to me, not being a scholar of Paul Schrader's life and work necessarily, but it feels real. There's a lot of heart in this film. Not in an uplifting way like people usually think of when they say a lot of heart in something like this, a film, or heartfelt performances of it. No, it's not a masterclass in acting on behalf of Joan Jett. She got some bad reviews and some good reviews for it, but it's her first time, and I don't know, I believed her. She's kind of manic, and she's hard to deal with as a family member and a band member. Lots of us have been around people like that, and we've believed in people like that. And we've done our best to take care of people like that and encourage them as best we can. And she's a bit of a wayward soul. And there's reasons for that become revealed later in the movie. But there's a lot of conflict around her and her mom's religious viewpoint about how Patty should be living her life. Patty, in a lot of ways, is another sort of presentation of Joan Jett and her ideals and her values. Not ripping people off and selling their shit for money necessarily, or, involving her kid in a grocery store theft scam, but standing up to what society tells you you're supposed to be doing at your age as a woman and doing the thing that you're passionate about instead, i.e. things like this.
We gotta tighten up when we get back out on the road. We gotta attack. Smack in the face. More reverb, staccato repeats. Drum crashes. Metal riffs, further out.
Metal?
Yeah.
Shit, come on, Patty. I wasn't a metalhead when everybody else was a metalhead.
Yeah, not just metal. A new sound like techno-pop metal.
What?
I mean, you can play it, and the lyrics are no problem.
Metal ain't got lyrics.
That's what I mean.
She's not wrong. Techno-pop metal would become a very commercially viable thing about 5 years after this, movie came out in its own way. And then even more so in the early 2000s. I mean, techno-pop metal was all over the place. Not for the longest amount of time, but that could be more due to Clear Channel owning everything and all the entertainment companies merging together and becoming the same conglomerate. But that's a discussion for another time. I think that's most of what I wanted to say about this movie. It is something totally original in all its own, I would say, without being stylistically wacky. It's unlike any other rock and roll movie I've seen so far. I can't think of anything else even remotely like it. I'm sure there's other blue collar stories of, rock bands in the Midwest trying to make it, but they're usually a little more fun or a little silly or maybe even absurd at times or stylistically, artistically presented in a different way. And by different way, I mean visually stylized and artsy-fartsy, or much more dour and defeatist in the tone of the story and the fates of the characters. But the movie does convey through the characters a bit of the middle-of-the-road rock and roll gripiness about how, things weren't really staying in place as far as the public's taste for bands that were kind of plain and had mullets and wore blue jeans and flannel shirts or whatever, or collared shirts, as the aforementioned Huey Lewis and Fabulous Thunderbirds, etc. But the kind of voices in this script that are angry about the things that, let's say, Joan Jett goes off and does with her more extreme versions of like these, aggressive wheedly guitar noodly glam rock, hard rock bands stuff, coming in and being more gimmicky and taking the eyeballs away. It's very similar to what happens in a few more years when the quote unquote grunge bands come and wear flannel and blue jeans and take the eyeballs away from the wheedly glam heavy metal hard rock bands. You can't have a lock on the entire public's record buying attention forever. It lasts a few years. People get out of high school, get out of their college partying years. They start settling down. They get into more boring stuff, or they go back to old stuff in as far as the casual music listener goes in the 70s, 80s, and before. But there is this often heard backlash of people just wanting it to stay the same. Like, oh, that new music's not real music. Oh, it's too whiny. Oh, it's too screamy. Oh, it's too gimmicky. Oh, it's got keyboards in it. Oh, it's got programmed drums in it. It's not even music. You heard it for years and years and years. Every 3 to 5 years, there's a new trend, and the previous trend just bitches about it. The field gets narrower, and your thing gets a little harder to succeed in, and it works out for bands like Bruce Hornsby and the Range for a little while. It works out for Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band until Bruce Springsteen gets bored with that and then shuts down the E Street Band for a good 10 or more years and does solo stuff, right? And then brings them back and everyone's happy about it. But hey, you've heard me yammer about this film, and you've heard me say it's good quality stuff from a director and writer with a vision, and you've heard me say that the performances are worth taking in, and they're passionate and they're earnest, and there's a lot going on in this movie. There's a lot of emotion in the movie. I hope you understand I'm saying it's not easy to digest, okay? And it's not for most people, probably. But I don't know everyone's taste that's listening to this podcast. I generally don't recommend anything I like for the people that I love and care about in my life, because I know I'm a fucking scumbag and have weird tastes in things. And I will sit through certain things longer than most people will, especially for research. But I'm a veteran of many, many, many long hours of watching exploitation films and obscure horror films and weird, boring sci-fi. But usually, if it's weird, boring sci-fi, I'm watching it with the benefit of cast members of Mystery Science Theater 3000. So before I wrap up on Light of Day, let's go to an unbiased source, because obviously, since most people haven't heard about this film, we can surmise it didn't do well at the box office. I only found it in any sort of streaming fashion at the time I started researching this episode months ago, in an uploaded VHS copy on YouTube. So there's that for you. But people, I guess, in Variety called Joan Jett's readings childish and silly. It got some mixed reviews in the movie reviewing press, not exactly anything glowing. I don't think anybody probably told everyone to run out and go see this movie. I think it was probably fairly personal for Paul Schrader. But instead of telling a personal story about himself, he put a rock band story in the middle of it too. Maybe there's too many themes and there's too many characters fighting and struggling all the time in this movie. That's kind of what happens. I mean, to a mild spoiler here, it's essentially Joan Jett's character, Patty, doesn't get along with her mom, gets in a fight with her brother, leaves her brother's band, brother carries on without her and loses his job, then tries to kind of sort of get his job back. Then Patty fails to keep another band together, comes back to him at a bar gig at the very, very end, and everyone's happy, at least for that night. But, in the middle of all that, there's a big, big, big emotional mother and daughter conflict that gets resolved in a very interesting and I guess I would say satisfying way for what it is. But it's a major bomb drop for the audience to realize what the source of all this struggle is between the mother and daughter characters. But as I was saying, let's go to an unbiased source. Let's go to someone that has no real dog in this fight. Author Tommy Udo of Nine Inch Nails, the unauthorized biography. And I'm going to read his words straight out the book. I've been pontificating enough. You've heard enough of me on the speaking, from the hip, as it were, for a little while. And here he's talking about Trent Reznor's limited amount of time playing shows or playing with bands in Cleveland, Ohio. Reznor also joined a succession of small-time Cleveland bands. The most embarrassing seems to have been a mainstream hard rock band called The Innocent. Foreigner crap, dinosaur, AOR, bullshit rock. Apparently those are Trent Reznor's words. Although he didn't play on their album Livin' on the Streets, his photograph did appear on the record sleeve. As ghosts from the past go, there are worse. More embarrassing pictures to be found. With a keyboard slung over his shoulder and bearing in mind that nobody in the 80s ever looked good, he is recognizable, albeit just. He's still extremely touchy about the picture. Talking to Details, I guess magazine, whose writer had dredged up a copy to confront him with, he called himself stupid, dumb, ridiculous, 1983 sissy. You got me. I'm an idiot. I've tried to hide it. It was the one thing I was waiting for someone to throw at me. He left after 3 months. He'd also had his first brush with the movies at this time. He appeared in a flop film that starred Michael J. Fox and Joan Jett called Light of Day as a member of a po-faced synth trio who were known as The Problems, though the lineup may have been the same as The Exotic Birds, which was the germ of the first touring incarnation of Nine Inch Nails. They appeared as objects of derision. The film is a confused and downbeat family drama. Fox and Joan Jett play a brother and sister who sneak off to play in a local rock and roll band. It says much about the movie that Michael J. Fox's singing is not the worst, nor is Joan Jett's acting the poorest performance. Reznor does not have a speaking role, but appears for several minutes. I wouldn't say that's the case. I think it's more of a few seconds. I don't know if he saw a director's cut of this or what. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I glossed over more of it, but they used to be called The Sins. Now they're called The Problems, one of the characters says of them. I think it's Michael McKean's character. The film is awful despite being written and directed by Paul Schrader, screenwriter of Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, director of Blue Collar, Hardcore, and American Gigolo, but has become a cult film among Nine Inch Nails devotees, with copies of the now unavailable VHS trading on eBay for around $50. I don't know that that's still the case. Personally, this is a book published in 2002. So there you go. This is more Trent Reznor content than you bet you figured you had coming to you when you clicked on a Michael J. Fox, Joan Jett, Lita Ford podcast episode, right? Now, we better get back to the land of Lita here. In case she gets mad, comes after me. Heaven is in the palm of my hands and it's waiting here for you. And it's coming up next with a little bit more Lita Ford talk. Hey, this is your reminder to drink some water. Hydrate. Hydrate. Take your vitamins. Get outside and get some fresh air for a few minutes today. Maybe call your mother or somebody that misses you. Right before the video for Kiss Me Deadly was scheduled to start shooting, Lita decides that before they do that and, go on tour to support her album, she's going to dye her own hair. She said she's never done it before because she was always horrible with hair, but figured, how hard can it be? She went not to a hairstylist, but to a pharmacy to buy bleach. She didn't really know the different various strengths of bleach for hair color, but she decided to buy the strongest one she could find. Looking at the directions, it said to leave in her hair for 20 minutes and no longer. She thought, okay, big deal. Well, during that 20 minutes, somebody called her on the phone. And eventually, 45 minutes to maybe an hour later, she realized, oh shit, I gotta go. Hangs up the phone, washes out the bleach, gets dressed, gets in her car, drives to a meeting in Hollywood. Didn't have time to dry her hair, so she says when she got in the car, rolled down the windows to let the wind dry it from the movement of the car on the freeway. Her hair was so wet, she decided to run her fingers through it, thinking that would help it dry, shake it out. Well, clumps of hair start coming off in her fingers. And it keeps happening over and over and over again as she runs her hands through her hair while she's driving. Just strands and strands and strands of hair falling out of her head. She had burned off all the hair on the back lower part of her head and neck and didn't know what to do about it. So Sharon Osbourne, who is her manager at that time, takes her to a professional stylist who suggests hair extensions. She doesn't know what those are, but doesn't have a choice. Sharon decides, okay, fine, time for a new look. And they get these blue-black hair extensions to fill in the areas where, her natural hair had fallen out. And then, her other hair starts growing back in, and it has a totally interesting look that she wouldn't have predicted doing for herself. And according to Lita, a lot of her own fans started dyeing her hair blue, black, and blonde together to make it like a cool look that people were really into. Obviously, they didn't know about the accident that started this whole thing. She said, Sharon was great at creating my new images, but she also had a list of changes she wanted me to make. One thing is, you must get rid of Tony, your tech. I said, why? Besides being my close friend, Tony was a great tech, and I saw no reason to get rid of her. Sharon said, because everyone will think you are gay. But I didn't believe it was the real reason. I think it was a control issue. Sharon had to have things her way, and Tony was always looking out for me and looking over everybody's shoulder. I don't think Sharon liked that. I didn't want to do it, but Sharon let Tony go, which made me resentful. However, Sharon also booked me on John Bon Jovi's New Jersey Syndicate tour, which was huge for me. I had to put business before personal. So let's talk about the video for Kiss Me Deadly and the video for Close My Eyes Forever. Before those were shot, Lita's rolling around Hollywood with her good friend Patty and sees an electrical worker on a telephone pole wearing a pair of jeans that were shredded all the way up the front and thought, hey, those would look great on me. She gives her friend Patty $100 to go talk to the guy and wrangle him out of those jeans. So he tells her friend Patty he's got another pair just like him at home, and Patty arranges to meet him at the same telephone pole the next day with another $100 for his work jeans. Then Lita gives them to a clothing designer that she knew at the time, and I probably, had them severely altered to fit her instead of this construction telephone, pole climber guy, and wore them in both those videos, Close My Eyes Forever and Kiss Me Deadly. She also notes that her own mother wouldn't let her walk her dog in front of her mom and dad's house while she was wearing those jeans because she thought it was so obscene that she'd be, possibly seen by their neighbors who would be judging them, obviously. Lita notes, little did she know that they would be on heavy rotation on MTV. They became quite the fashion statement in the late 1980s and remained part of the rock and roll dress code for years to come. I like to think I had a part in making that happen. Sorry, Mom. Fun notes about the making of the video for Kiss Me Deadly. She had a choreographer named Anne-Marie Hunter work with her on that one. Booked time for just the two of them to work in Jane Fonda's studio, apparently, to sort of rehearse for the video. Anne-Marie was hooking her up with Jack Daniels to keep her nice and loosened up, I guess, during the choreography rehearsals. And then after they did some shots, or at least Lita did some shots, I don't know what the choreographer was drinking, Anne-Marie had some of the girls from a roller derby league come in and show me how to fall and slide without putting pressure on the wrong parts of my body. As crazy as it sounds, she had to teach me how to fall in order to get that slide on knee pads just right for the video. She goes on to say, the video for Kiss Me Deadly became a hot, sexy anthem on MTV, but it sure didn't start out that way. I guess I must have been a little too loose after the Jack Daniels because as I was working on the choreographed moves Anne-Marie had shown me, I stumbled and slammed into the wall behind me. The problem was that the wall was made of mirrors, and before I knew it, there was glass all over the place. By the time I was done bumping into mirrored walls and sliding across the floor on knee pads, I owed Jane Fonda's studio $750. They shot the video with a director named Marty Callner, who was filming them in the same warehouse that they used for like Aerosmith, Poison, and Cher videos. And after it came out, they went from small clubs to like 20,000 people in arenas around the world. Now, more about Sharon and Ozzy Osbourne during this time. They used to come over to Lita's house. Well, Lita's mom and dad's house, I guess, at this time still, for dinner, drinks, and things like that. And despite the fact that her mom was so disgusted by her ripped up blue jeans, Lita claims that there was nothing Ozzy could do to freak her parents out. They had seen it all in the Runaway days. In fact, they were amused by Ozzy, and they liked him and Sharon very much. How could they not? The Osbournes are wonderful people. They would pull up to my parents' house in a big black limo. The entire neighborhood would poke their heads out to see what was going on, and they realize, oh, it's only Lita with her rock stars. This seems to be a common theme when it comes to the relationships people have with Sharon and Ozzy. Like, especially Sharon, she's incredibly manipulative and overbearing and sometimes demoralizing and demeaning to work for. And yet, people just, I don't know, talk about her as being so pleasant and that they owe her a lot, blah, blah, blah. Unless, they really, really hate her. Unless they've never benefited from her professional presence in their lives ever, of course. And there's nothing to lose. There's nothing to lose by bad-mouthing somebody. You can say whatever you want about Sharon Osbourne because you're never going to get an opportunity from her, right? Not to say that it isn't all warranted. I'm sure it is. To the people who have had those experiences and feel that way. It's a great story in Lita's book about how one time on a jumbo jet flying to London, Ozzy passed out in the aisleway, and Sharon kept poking him with a fork while trying to wake him up, but all she ended up doing was just putting lots and lots of holes into his favorite suit. He woke up as the plane was landing, found a bunch of holes in his coat, started screaming at her, "Why do I have these fucking holes in my bloody coat, Sharon?" She calmly told him, "You were blocking the aisle. Nobody could pass by you." She also mentions the fact that Sharon and Ozzy bought her a giant life-size replica of Coco the gorilla. I think Coco was at San Diego Zoo at the time. And they were playing pool, drinking wine after that. Hours and hours go by. Sharon gets bored and takes off. And then in another little room with a keyboard and a small amplifier, Ozzy and Lita end up writing "Close My Eyes Forever." Late at night. And then after they're finishing up, sun's coming up, and Ozzy, gets a little freaked out because he's got to get home. Lita refuses to drive him home. She's like, "We've been drinking all night. Take a fucking cab. I can't make the Laurel Canyon Drive drunk." And this must be in some, I don't know, like a rehearsal studio or someone else's house, because she talks about driving home eventually with the giant gorilla strapped in the passenger seat, and then gets a phone call when she does get home, right when she's trying to fall asleep. It's Sharon saying, "Well, I've got one sniffer. Now I've got two." She was pissed. I wonder if she thought Ozzy and I were fucking each other, but all we did was play guitar and sing. She asked me one day, "Lita, I was gone for 3 days, out of town on business, and when I came back, I found a tampon underneath Ozzy's bed in this hotel room. You don't know anything about it, do you?" Lita says, "I didn't hang out with Ozzy during those 3 days, and I didn't know anything about it." Note about the word sniffer. I've never used that in a sentence before today. Certainly didn't grow up with it. Don't know exactly what it means. A 5-minute search on Urban Dictionary gives a few different results, but the most likely one seems to be a gold digger in American parlance, or a pre-gold digger, or someone working on becoming a gold digger. Also, according to Lita, Sharon really didn't want "Close My Eyes Forever" to come out. She had been voted best female rock vocalist by Metal Edge, and Ozzy was voted best male rock vocalist at the same time. They were both being managed by Sharon, and it seemed like a no-brainer. It would be a hit. Apparently, she didn't want Ozzy and her together on screen for the video, and she went and asked the record company, "Is this true? Does she not want to release this as a single?" They said, "Yes, but we're going to release it anyway." She said, "For once, Sharon didn't get her way. It was released on my label under Lita Ford and became a top 10 hit single, which is something none of us predicted." Which is funny. I wondered about that when I saw that it was on Lita's album and not on an Ozzy collection of any kind back in the, when I saw it in the 90s or whatever. Like, people that I knew that liked Ozzy Osbourne complained about that. Like, I had to buy a whole Lita Ford album on compact disc to get that Ozzy Osbourne song. There's another great story. I mean, damn it, she's full of good ones. About going to see the Scorpions at Irvine Meadows. And she was driving by herself. She got stuck in the traffic that happens when you're waiting in line to get into the amphitheater parking. And she busts out a bag of weed with some purple hair in it, lights it up, gets totally stoned, arrives at the show, goes backstage, say hello to the band, and then plans just to go sit out in the crowd. But Doc McGee, Scorpions manager, saw her and brought her over to talk about the possibility of jamming on stage with the Scorpions or singing with Klaus tonight. She says, "Oh, thanks, but it's my day off, and I'm just going to go out in the audience and watch the show." And, unfortunately, on her way back to the main audience section, she sees there's a giant white chocolate cheesecake inside the Scorpions dressing room, like 2 tiers high. And she's got the munchies really bad from the weed she smoked before she got in. And thought about stealing a slice and then thought better of it and just kind of runs back out to the audience and sits down in her spot. Then, when the show's almost over, she decides, well, concert's almost done. Fuck this. I need that cheesecake. Goes backstage, and the only people she sees back there near the cake are Sebastian Bach and Christina Applegate, who are making out. They didn't look, according to Lita, they didn't look like they were going to get between me and that cheesecake. I grabbed a great big piece and dove in. As I was chowing down, I could still hear the Scorpions playing in the distance, and then I heard Klaus say, "We have Lita Ford in the audience tonight! Lita, come up here and sing with me!" Lita's not having it. She's freaked out. She's too stoned, and she's not leaving the cheesecake, so she just takes her slice of cake underneath the table and hides behind the tablecloth until the show's over, and then has to apologize to Klaus afterwards for not answering his call to come out on stage. Now, could I go on and on and on and on and on about awesome Lita Ford stories that I found in her autobiography? Yep. And it would be tempting. So I highly recommend you check out her book and, other resources I've already mentioned on this episode. If you want to know more about her, Joan, Cherie, the Runaways, not the Runaways. I also encourage you to make use of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline if you or anyone you know might need it. It's 1-800-273-8255. As well as the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which is 1-800-656-4673. I give out that number after most episodes or during most episodes, but, I was definitely not going to let the Runaways episodes slip by without throwing that in there. Just so you know, that is available to you or anyone else that might need it. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, sometime. Statistically, it could come in handy for lots of people. If you want to support what I'm doing, there's a Linktree link or some kind of link in the description that you could check out. Follow me on the Instagram. Check out Buy Me a Coffee link. And hopefully soon I'll have some t-shirts up that have various obnoxious statements and designs on them that may not necessarily relate directly to this channel, but my sense of humor anyways. Also, I have a band, the Double Cross Committee. Check out if we're coming to your town. We're not coming to your town. We're not doing a lot of anything right now, but our music's good and it's getting better, and more recordings will be coming in the following year. Maybe you're listening to this in the following year and things are actually cooking for us as far as having an online presence. I don't know. Whatever you do, do it earnestly, even if it's clumsy and awful and embarrassing like my slide work tends to be. Take care of somebody today if you can, all right? Take care of yourself if nothing else. Rock and roll is the absolute best. We are lucky to have had it for as long as we have. And you are also really, really good. Someone is very lucky to have you, and you absolutely deserve to be happy and deserve to be safe and deserve to be able to pursue what it is you want to do with your life. And you're also allowed to change that at any minute.